November 15th, 1941. A frozen supply depot outside Tula, 120 kilometers south of Moscow. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov crouched beside the wreckage of what had been the Third Army's motor transport column. 17 Soviet trucks lay scattered across the muddy field, their engines seized from cold, their fuel lines cracked, their wooden cargo beds splintered by German artillery. The mathematics of defeat were written in the snow around him. Of the 200 trucks his regiment had possessed in June, fewer than 30 remained operational. The rest had succumbed to mechanical failure, enemy action, or the simple, brutal reality that Soviet industry had never produced vehicles capable of sustaining the punishment of total war. Volkov pulled a crumpled report from his greatcoat, the pencil trembling in his frozen fingers as he recorded the day's losses. 17 more vehicles, inoperative, no spare parts available. Regiment immobilized until further notice. He paused, then added words that would have earned him a tribunal 6 months earlier. Our trucks are inadequate for modern warfare. The collapse had begun with Operation Barbarossa. In the opening weeks of the German invasion, the Red Army discovered that its pre-war logistics doctrine was a fantasy built on assumptions that crumbled under the first artillery barrage. Soviet trucks, when they existed at all, were a heterogeneous collection of aging models with incompatible parts, insufficient fuel capacity, and mechanical reliability that bordered on criminally negligent. The ZIS-5, the backbone of Soviet motor transport, could carry 3 tons under ideal conditions, but rarely encountered ideal conditions. Its gasoline engine consumed fuel at rates that made extended operations impossible, while its transmission regularly failed after just 20,000 kilometers. More critically, spare parts were virtually non-existent. A broken fan belt could immobilize an entire convoy for days. By autumn 1941, Soviet logistics officers were producing reports that read like obituaries for mechanized warfare. Colonel Ivan Petrov, commanding the 15th Motor Transport Regiment, documented the systematic collapse in a classified memo that survived the war. Of 180 trucks assigned in June, 143 are inoperative due to mechanical failure, battle damage, or lack of fuel. Remaining vehicles can transport maximum 90 tons daily, insufficient to supply 1 rifle battalion for sustained combat. The human cost was measured in tons of ammunition that never reached the front, in hospitals that couldn't be supplied with medical equipment, in soldiers who marched hundreds of kilometers because transport had broken down. At the Vyazma encirclement in October 1941, entire divisions were cut off not by German tactical brilliance, but by the simple inability of Soviet logistics to maintain supply lines across the vast distances of the Eastern Front. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Kozlov, a mechanical engineer conscripted from the Gorky Automobile Works, kept a technical diary that provided devastating testimony to Soviet automotive inadequacy. Today repaired the same ZIS, 5 for the 4th time this month, he wrote on November 8th. The engine block has 3 separate cracks. The differential leaks oil continuously, and the electrical system fails every time it rains. We patch and pray, but these machines were never designed for war. The statistics painted a picture of systemic failure. Soviet industry had produced approximately 145,000 trucks in 1940, but military requirements called for over 300,000 vehicles to support the Red Army's expanded wartime structure. This shortfall became catastrophic when German advances captured or destroyed Soviet industrial capacity in Ukraine and Belarus. More fundamentally, Soviet truck design philosophy emphasized simplicity over durability, reflecting an industrial base that prioritized quantity over quality. The typical Soviet military truck of 1,941 featured a basic suspension system, minimal weather sealing, and engine components that wore out rapidly under continuous operation. Maintenance intervals were theoretical rather than practical, as spare parts shortages forced crews to operate vehicles far beyond their design limits. The fuel crisis compounded mechanical failures. Soviet logistics calculated fuel requirements based on peacetime consumption patterns, failing to account for the dramatically increased fuel consumption of combat operations. Trucks carrying supplies to forward positions often consumed their entire reserve fuel load, just reaching the front line, leaving no margin for return trips or emergency operations. The winter of 1941 delivered the final blow to Soviet mobile logistics. Temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius turned mechanical problems into transportation catastrophes. Carburetors froze solid, requiring drivers to pour warm water over engine components before attempting to start. Rubber fuel lines became brittle and snapped. Oil congealed into sludge that destroyed engine bearings. At the Leningrad depot, responsible for supplying the Road of Life across frozen Lake Ladoga, maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep trucks operational. Their daily logs recorded a litany of failure. November 20th, 23 vehicles in workshop, frozen fuel pumps, cracked engine blocks, stripped transmission gears. Daily operational rate, 31% of assigned vehicles. By December 1941, Red Army logistics had effectively ceased to function as a mechanized operation. Supplies moved by rail to the maximum extent possible, then transferred to horse-drawn wagons for the final kilometers to front-line positions. The Soviet Union, which had proclaimed itself the vanguard of industrial modernity, found itself fighting the world's most mechanized army with transportation methods that wouldn't have been out of place in 1914. The psychological impact on Soviet commanders was profound. General Georgy Zhukov, coordinating the defense of Moscow, filed reports that barely concealed his frustration. Motor transport reliability has fallen to unacceptable levels. Divisions report critical shortages of ammunition, medical supplies, and winter equipment due to transportation failures. Without immediate improvement in logistics capacity, sustained defensive operations become impossible. Stalin's response was characteristically direct. On December 7, 1941, he summoned his logistics chiefs to the Kremlin and delivered a verdict that would reshape the war. Our trucks are worthless. Our factories cannot produce what we need fast enough. We must look elsewhere for solutions, or we will lose this war. That elsewhere would prove to be 8,000 kilometers away, in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of the American East Coast. The solution was already beginning its journey across the Atlantic, carried in the holds of cargo ships braving German U-boats and winter storms. America was about to deliver the Red Army's salvation in the form of 427,000 trucks that would transform the Eastern Front from a graveyard of broken-down Soviet vehicles into a mechanized juggernaut, capable of rolling all the way to Berlin. March 23, 1942. The port of Archangel, frozen solid except for the narrow channel kept open by Soviet icebreakers. Captain Boris Fedorov watched through binoculars as the American Liberty ship SS Thomas Scott maneuvered toward the dock, its hull scarred by ice and salt water, its holds packed with cargo that would either save the Red Army or represent the most expensive humanitarian gesture in history. The first American trucks began rolling off the ship's cargo ramps at 0800 hours, and Fedorov found himself staring at machines that contradicted everything he thought he knew about automotive engineering. These weren't the crude utility vehicles he had expected, but sophisticated pieces of industrial equipment that radiated competence from every bolt and rivet. The Studebaker US-6, destined to become the most beloved truck in the Red Army, measured exactly what its specifications claimed: 6.1 meters long, 2.3 meters wide, capable of carrying 2.5 tons across terrain that would destroy a Soviet ZIS-5. But specifications couldn't capture what became immediately obvious to Soviet mechanics gathering around the first vehicles to clear the dock. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Petrov, a motor transport veteran with 15 years' experience maintaining Soviet vehicles, approached the first Studebaker with the skepticism of a man who had been disappointed by machinery his entire career. He opened the hood and discovered an engine bay that challenged his understanding of automotive design philosophy. The engine was accessible, Petrov would write in a letter to his brother 6 months later. Not just theoretically accessible like our trucks, but genuinely accessible. Every component could be reached with standard tools. The oil filter could be changed without removing the exhaust manifold. The spark plugs were positioned where a man could actually reach them. It was as if the designers had consulted mechanics before finalizing the design. The Hercules JXD engine that powered the US-6 produced 87 horsepower, modest by American standards, but revolutionary for Soviet logistics. More importantly, it had been designed for sustained operation under adverse conditions. The cooling system included an auxiliary radiator capacity that prevented overheating during extended climbs. The ignition system featured weatherproof components that functioned in temperatures where Soviet electrical systems failed completely. Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Antonov, assigned to evaluate American equipment for the State Defense Committee, conducted the first systematic comparison between American and Soviet trucks. His classified report, discovered in Soviet archives in 1991, provided statistical confirmation of what Soviet mechanics had immediately recognized. The Studebaker US-6 demonstrates mechanical reliability approximately 300% superior to comparable Soviet vehicles. Fuel consumption is 15% lower despite carrying 25% greater payload. Maintenance intervals can be extended to 8,000 kilometers versus 3,000 for Soviet trucks. But statistics couldn't convey the psychological transformation that began when Soviet drivers first operated American vehicles. Senior Sergeant Pavel Volkov, who had commanded a ZIS-5 for 2 years before being assigned to an American truck, described the experience in his wartime diary. The steering wheel turned smoothly. Without the constant fight against mechanical resistance I had known with Soviet trucks, the transmission shifted cleanly through all gears. The brakes stopped the vehicle in a straight line without pulling to one side. These seem like small things, but to a driver, they represented the difference between a machine you battled and a machine you controlled. The arrival rate accelerated throughout 1942 as American production reached full capacity and convoy routes became established. The Persian Corridor, stretching from Iranian ports through Central Asia to the Soviet front lines, became a mechanized river of American vehicles, flowing northward at rates that strained Soviet logistics officers' ability to process and distribute the equipment. By autumn 1942, approximately 50,000 American trucks were operating with Soviet forces, and their impact was becoming measurable in operational statistics. The 3rd Guards Army, re-equipped with Studebakers and GMC vehicles, reported a 75% increase in ammunition delivery capacity and a 60% reduction in transportation-related delays. More importantly, mechanical breakdown rates fell from 23% daily to less than 4%. The GMC CCKW Deuce and a Half brought American mass production philosophy to the Eastern Front. These vehicles, manufactured on assembly lines that produced one complete truck every 45 minutes, featured standardized components that revolutionized Soviet maintenance practices. A single shipment of spare parts could support hundreds of vehicles, replacing the previous system where each truck model required unique components. Soviet mechanics discovered that American trucks had been designed with field maintenance in mind. Engine components were modular and interchangeable. Electrical systems used standard fittings that could be repaired with basic tools. Most remarkably, the vehicles included comprehensive maintenance manuals translated into Russian, complete with detailed diagrams and troubleshooting procedures. Major Nikolai Smirnov, commanding the 47th Motor Transport Battalion, documented the transformation in his unit's operational capacity. Before receiving American trucks, our battalion could transport 180 tons of supplies daily when all vehicles were operational, which occurred perhaps 3 days per month. With Studebakers and GMCs, we now transport 320 tons daily with 95% vehicle availability. The difference is not merely quantitative, but qualitative. Our drivers arrive at destinations rested rather than exhausted from fighting mechanical problems. The cultural impact proved as significant as the mechanical advantages. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to viewing trucks as unreliable burdens that required constant attention, began to trust their vehicles. This psychological shift enabled operational changes that multiplied the truck's tactical value. Units could plan complex maneuvers, knowing their transportation would function as intended. Artillery batteries could displace rapidly, confident their prime movers would start and their guns would reach new positions. The modification of American vehicles for Soviet conditions became an art form among Red Army mechanics. Studebakers were fitted with improvised cab heaters for winter operations. GMC trucks received reinforced floors for carrying artillery shells. Some vehicles were converted into mobile workshops, their cargo beds equipped with welding equipment and machine tools powered by the truck's electrical system. Most famously, American trucks became the preferred platform for Katyusha rocket launchers. The Studebakers' robust chassis and reliable engine made it ideal for mounting the BM-13 rocket system, creating the vehicle combination that would terrorize German forces throughout the war. Soviet factories had struggled to produce adequate launcher platforms, but American trucks provided the mobility and durability needed for effective rocket artillery operations. The winter of 1942–43 provided the ultimate test of American automotive engineering under Soviet conditions. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, conditions that had immobilized entire Soviet units the previous winter. American trucks, equipped with engine block heaters and cold weather starting aids, continued operating when Soviet vehicles froze solid. Sergeant Ivan Petrov, driver of a Studebaker, assigned to supply the Leningrad front, recorded the psychological impact. On December 15th, the temperature was -35. Our old ZIS trucks wouldn't start despite hours of warming attempts. I approached the Studebaker expecting the same problems, but the engine turned over on the second attempt. We completed 3 supply runs that day, while other units remained immobilized. For the first time in this war, I felt we had equipment worthy of our soldiers. By spring 1943, American trucks had become integral to Soviet operations. The vehicles that had arrived as emergency aid were now fundamental to Red Army logistics. Soviet commanders began planning operations based on American truck capacity rather than theoretical Soviet transport capabilities. The transformation was complete. The Red Army had become dependent on American automotive technology for its continued existence as a mechanized force. June 15th, 1943. The Kursk salient, where the largest tank battle in history was about to unfold. Colonel Alexei Rodimtsev crouched in a communications trench, listening to radio reports from supply units streaming toward the front lines. What he heard would have been impossible 18 months earlier. Soviet logistics functioning with mechanical precision. Transport Column Baker reports position 3 kilometers southeast of Ponyri, ETA 0230 hours, with full ammunition load, crackled through his radio. Transport Column Charlie, departing reload point on schedule. Cargo, 152 millimeters, shells and medical supplies. The streams of reports continued throughout the night, each one representing American trucks carrying the sinews of war to positions where they would determine the outcome of the German summer offensive. The Battle of Kursk would become history's largest demonstration of American automotive engineering under combat conditions. Over 100,000 American trucks participated in the operation, moving 2.3 million rounds of artillery ammunition, 850,000 anti-tank rounds, and sufficient fuel to keep 3,600 Soviet tanks operational during 2 weeks of continuous combat. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, the same officer who had witnessed the collapse of Soviet logistics in 1941, now commanded a motor transport company equipped entirely with American vehicles. His operational diary from Kursk documented the transformation. July 5th. Moved 340 tons ammunition to forward positions despite constant enemy air attack. Lost 2 Studebakers to Stuka bombing, but remaining vehicles completed all assigned missions. Compare this to 1,941, when mechanical failure alone would have immobilized half our vehicles before reaching the combat zone. The German offensive code-named Citadel encountered something unprecedented in Eastern Front warfare: Soviet logistics that functioned under pressure. American trucks enabled Soviet commanders to shift reserves rapidly, moving entire divisions hundreds of kilometers in response to German attacks. The flexibility that had characterized German operations since 1941 now belonged to the Red Army. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Central Front at Kursk, would later write in his memoirs, "The American trucks gave us operational mobility we had never possessed. I could order the 27th Army to redeploy 200 kilometers to counter a German breakthrough and know the movement would be completed on schedule." This confidence transformed how we planned operations. The scale of American truck operations at Kursk defied easy comprehension. During the peak of the battle, Soviet logistics moved 15,000 tons of supplies daily, using primarily American vehicles. A single ammunition convoy might stretch for 30 kilometers, its olive-drab trucks grinding through dust clouds raised by thousands of tires, the incessant clank of leaf springs mixing with engine noise to create the soundtrack of mechanized warfare. The numbers told the story of transformation. In 1941, Soviet motor transport had averaged 0.7 tons of supplies per truck per day during combat operations. By Kursk, American trucks were averaging 3.2 tons per truck daily while maintaining 94% operational availability. The difference represented the margin between military effectiveness and logistical collapse. Staff Sergeant Boris Petrov, a logistics officer who had survived the disasters of 1941, found himself managing supply operations that would have seemed fantastical 2 years earlier. "We established forward ammunition dumps 40 kilometers behind the lines," he recorded, then moved 500 tons of shells daily to forward positions using truck shuttles. The Americans had built machines that could absorb tremendous punishment while maintaining performance. The mechanical reliability that Soviet officers had initially viewed with skepticism proved crucial under combat stress. During the 9-day German offensive, American trucks operated continuously with minimal maintenance. Soviet mechanics, accustomed to spending half their time repairing vehicles, found themselves managing fleets that simply continued functioning despite the punishment of combat operations. Captain Mikhail Fedorov, commanding a Studebaker-equipped ammunition company, documented the psychological impact on his drivers. "My men began to trust their equipment for the first time in this war. They would accept missions that would have been suicide with Soviet trucks, knowing their vehicles would not fail them. This confidence enabled operational flexibility that multiplied our combat effectiveness." The adaptability of American trucks proved as important as their reliability. Soviet units discovered that Studebakers and GMCs could be rapidly reconfigured for changing missions. A truck carrying ammunition in the morning could transport wounded soldiers in the afternoon, then serve as a mobile command post during night operations. The standardized design philosophy enabled rapid mission changes that kept pace with fluid battle conditions. The fuel efficiency of American trucks revolutionized Soviet logistics calculations. The Studebaker US-6 consumed approximately 15 liters per 100 kilometers under combat conditions, compared to 28 liters for the Soviet ZIS-5. This efficiency meant that fuel convoys could travel twice as far, enabling supply operations at unprecedented distances from railheads. Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Smirnov, responsible for fuel distribution across 3 armies at Kursk, calculated the operational impact. American trucks enabled us to establish fuel dumps 80 kilometers forward of our rail terminals. This extended our operational reach by 150 kilometers, allowing us to support tank operations that would have been impossible with Soviet vehicles. The victory at Kursk validated the transformation of Soviet logistics. German forces, which had repeatedly broken through Soviet lines by exploiting logistical weaknesses, discovered an enemy that could sustain operations indefinitely. American trucks had provided the Red Army with the logistical foundation for sustained offensive operations. The success at Kursk triggered a fundamental shift in Soviet operational doctrine. Planning documents from late 1943 reveal that Soviet commanders had begun designing operations around American truck capacity rather than theoretical Soviet transport capabilities. The vehicles that had arrived as emergency aid had become the foundation of Red Army mobility. Senior General Alexei Antonov, Deputy Chief of the Soviet General Staff, issued a classified directive in August 1943. All future operations will assume transport capacity based on American vehicle performance standards. Soviet-manufactured trucks will be considered auxiliary to primary transport assets provided through Lend-Lease. The psychological transformation proved as significant as the mechanical advantages. Soviet soldiers who had spent 2 years fighting a war where logistics failure could doom the best tactical plans began to believe that victory was possible. The sight of endless columns of American trucks carrying supplies forward and wounded soldiers back created confidence that the Red Army could sustain the offensive operations necessary to drive the Germans from Soviet soil. By autumn 1943, American trucks were enabling operations that redefined the character of the Eastern Front. The Red Army's offensive at Smolensk advanced 350 kilometers in 3 weeks, a rate of advance sustained entirely by American motor transport. Soviet tank units, previously limited to operations within 50 kilometers of railroad terminals, now ranged across hundreds of kilometers of territory. The liberation of Ukraine demonstrated the full potential of American-equipped Soviet logistics. Operation Bagration, the destruction of German Army Group Center, moved 1.4 million Soviet soldiers and 5,200 tanks across 600 kilometers of front in 4 weeks. American trucks carried 2.8 million tons of supplies during the operation, enabling the largest successful offensive in Soviet military history. The transformation was complete. The Red Army that had nearly collapsed under logistical constraints in 1941 had become a mechanized force capable of sustained operations across continental distances. American automotive engineering had provided the sinews that bound Soviet tactical skill into strategic effectiveness. May 8, 1945. Berlin had fallen. The Third Reich lay in ruins. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin raised his glass at a victory celebration that would be remembered not for its triumph, but for a moment of unprecedented honesty about the nature of Soviet victory. The man who had built his career on projecting unshakable strength was about to acknowledge a debt that would shape the post-war world. I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war, Stalin declared to his assembled generals and Allied representatives. The most important things in this war are the machines. The United States is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war. The words hung in the air like artillery smoke. For 4 years, Soviet propaganda had proclaimed the Red Army's victories as purely Soviet achievements, the triumph of socialist industry, and communist determination over fascist aggression. Now the dictator himself was acknowledging what every Soviet logistics officer knew, but had been forbidden to admit. American trucks had kept the Red Army mobile when Soviet industry could not. General Georgy Zhukov, the hero of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Berlin, would later expand on Stalin's admission in a 1963 interview that captured the full scope of Soviet dependence. Today, it is said that the Allies never provided any help, but it cannot be denied that the Americans drove us off the hook. If they had not helped us, we could not have equipped our armies held in reserve and been unable to continue the war. The statistics that Soviet officials had classified throughout the war painted a picture of dependence that challenged the narrative of Soviet self-sufficiency. Of the 2.6 million trucks in Red Army service by war's end, 427,000 were American-manufactured vehicles provided through Lend-Lease. These American trucks had carried approximately 85% of Soviet ammunition, 75% of Soviet fuel, and 60% of Soviet food during the final 2 years of the war. The human testimonies proved even more devastating to Soviet mythology. Nikita Khrushchev, who would later lead the Soviet Union, wrote in his memoirs with characteristic bluntness, "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. One-on-one against Hitler's Germany, we would not have withstood its onslaught and would have lost the war." Colonel Viktor Antonov, the logistics officer who had first evaluated American trucks at Archangel, spent his post-war years calculating the operational impact of Lend-Lease vehicles. His classified analysis, completed for the General Staff in 1947, concluded that Soviet victory would have been impossible without American automotive support. The Red Army's offensive operations, from 1943 to 1945, were entirely dependent on American truck transport. Soviet industry could not have produced adequate vehicles in the quantities required, nor could Soviet logistics have sustained the operational tempo that characterized our victorious campaigns. The mechanics who had maintained American vehicles throughout the war provided the most detailed testimony to their importance. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Petrov, who had serviced both Soviet and American trucks, testified to a post-war commission. American trucks functioned at twice the reliability rate of Soviet vehicles while carrying heavier loads across greater distances. Without them, our armies would have been immobilized by mechanical failure before reaching German territory. The transformation of Soviet industrial capacity told its own story. American trucks had not merely supplemented Soviet production, they had enabled the Soviet war economy to focus on weapons production rather than transport vehicles. The 427,000 trucks provided through Lend-Lease had freed Soviet factories to produce the tanks, artillery, and aircraft that won battles, while American industry provided the logistics foundation that moved those weapons to the front. The geographic scope of American truck operations revealed their strategic importance. Soviet forces had advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin, a distance of 2,100 kilometers, supplied primarily by American vehicles. The famous photograph of Soviet trucks parked before the Brandenburg Gate showed Studebakers and GMCs that had carried ammunition across half of Europe, their olive-drab paint scarred by shrapnel, and their engines still running after 3 years of continuous combat. Marshal Alexei Antonov, who had coordinated Soviet logistics throughout the war, provided perhaps the most comprehensive assessment of American automotive impact in a 1946 classified report. American trucks enabled the Red Army to maintain offensive operations across continental distances while sustaining logistical complexity that would have been impossible with Soviet transport alone. The vehicles provided operational mobility that transformed the character of the Eastern Front. The post-war fate of American trucks provided additional evidence of their importance. Rather than scrapping the vehicles after victory, The Soviet Union kept them in service for decades. Many Studebakers and GMCs continued operating in civilian roles throughout the 1,950 seconds, their mechanical reliability making them more valuable than newly manufactured Soviet trucks. Soviet truck design philosophy underwent permanent transformation based on wartime experience with American vehicles. The post-war ZIL and GAZ truck series incorporated design elements learned from Studebaker and GMC engineering, including modular components, standardized maintenance procedures, and improved mechanical reliability. The Persian Corridor, which had delivered 159,000 American trucks through Iran, became a template for post-war Soviet logistics doctrine. The system of supply depots, maintenance facilities, and fuel distribution networks, established to support American vehicles, formed the foundation of Soviet military logistics for the remainder of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's attempt to minimize Lend-Lease contributions in post-war historical accounts could not erase the documentary evidence of dependence. Soviet logistics reports, operational summaries, and unit histories from 1942 to 1945 consistently referenced American vehicles as primary transport assets rather than supplementary equipment. The human cost of hypothetical defeat without American trucks provided the most compelling argument for their importance. Soviet casualties from 1,943 to 1,945 totaled approximately 11 million military deaths. Without American logistics support, Soviet forces would have lacked the mobility and supply capacity necessary for successful offensive operations, potentially extending the war for years and multiplying casualties exponentially. The strategic implications extended beyond the Eastern Front. American trucks had enabled the Red Army to reach Central Europe by 1945, establishing the geopolitical foundation for Soviet post-war influence. Without American automotive support, German forces might have stabilized defensive positions far to the east, fundamentally altering the post-war European balance of power. The final assessment came from Stalin himself in a private conversation recorded by Yugoslav communist leader Milovan Djilas in 1944. "This is a war of engines and octane. I drink to the American auto industry and American oil. They were the decisive factors in our victory." The admission, made to a trusted ally rather than for public consumption, represented the most honest assessment of American automotive contribution to Soviet victory. The 427,000 American trucks that had rolled across the Eastern Front represented more than mechanical assistance. They had provided the mobility that enabled Soviet ideology to survive its greatest test. The vehicles that had arrived as emergency aid in 1941 had become the foundation of Soviet victory by 1945. In the end, the greatest tribute to American trucks was not the official gratitude expressed at victory celebrations, but the simple fact that Soviet forces had advanced from the gates of Moscow to the heart of Berlin without experiencing the logistical collapse that had characterized the first year of the war. American automotive engineering had provided the Red Army with something it had never possessed: the mechanical reliability necessary to sustain continental warfare. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The Red Army that had entered the war with horse-drawn supply wagons had emerged as a mechanized force capable of projecting power across Eurasia. American trucks had provided the foundation for that transformation, enabling Soviet tactical skill and strategic vision to achieve victory over the most formidable military machine in human history. The 427,000 trucks had done more than win a war. They had preserved the possibility of Soviet victory when that victory had seemed impossible. In the honest words of the men who had commanded and driven them, they had saved the Soviet Union itself.